You got out of bed this morning. You're a hero.
Yep, that's right. Welcome back to Reason Together, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff. I'm Thomas. There's Daniel over there.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Do I sound kind of like bassy, gravelly? Good morning.
No, you sound
really...
normal. I'm kind of feeling
good.
like I sound that way this morning. I had kind of a shorter night's sleep last night. I just couldn't fall asleep, so I'm feeling kind of groggy this morning. So.
Wouldn't it be strange if we introduced the episode one time with totally different voices, like two different people? They'd be like, "Wait, what? I recognize
April
the word,
1st is coming
but
up,
not the voice." Yeah. Oh boy. Well, welcome to the conversation here. That is Tom and my conversation, just about a number of things that connect to life in some way or another, and we're trying to connect it with Scripture. That's just a part of life. We're not talking about systematic theology here necessarily. We're just talking about various thoughts and questions that come to our mind, but we like your feedback, and we've dealt with a number of listener questions in the past, sometimes entire episodes, and if you'd like to throw a question at us that's been on your mind, don't think, oh, that's a ridiculous question. Now, I'm not going to deny that there are some ridiculous questions, but sometimes a meaningly, what my mind's not engaged here. Sometimes what did I mean to say by that? Sometimes okay, I lost the word there. Seemingly, thank you. That's the word I was looking for. A seemingly insignificant question really turns out a substantive conversation. And so, anyway, we want to hear your feedback, your questions. What do you think about what we're talking about? Do you have a different take on it? We won't be offended. And we might be deeply hurt, but we won't be offended. And so just send it to reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. That's reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com.
Yes, and we do want to thank our patrons who financially support this podcast. If you want to become one of them, you can go over to patreon.com/reasontogether and jump on the bandwagon and become a patron supporter of this show. We are grateful for all of those who do. And if you want to check that out, that's patreon.com/reasontogether. Also, if you haven't heard yet, we are now on Spotify. Spotify is a pretty big audio media platform. And I think, if I remember, the first time we tried to get on there, we got rejected.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but we are now on there. So I guess we cut the mustard now, or I guess it was probably a mistake. We managed to slip through the cracks. But we are now on Spotify. So check that out over there if you are a Spotify user. Also, we are hiring an editor, looking to hire an editor. If you're still interested in that, and send us an email at reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com or submit a contact form through the website. We've had a couple respondents thus far that we're looking at, but we want to see if anyone else is interested too, and kind of look at all the responses that we get. So be sure to check that out if you are interested.
All right, looking back to some previous episodes, we have some feedback here, and I'm going to pull up this one here on Facebook. We had a response. Let me see if I can pull up this entire thing. Somebody responded to us. What was that? This one on algebra.
Oh, okay. I see it there. That's Ruth.
Yeah.
Yep.
You got it? Go ahead.
Yeah, I got it. You want me to read it?
Sure.
Okay. This is from Ruth. And she says, I appreciated the comments about the value of learning advanced math, among other things. I once had someone ask me, since I taught higher math at the time, if I thought algebra was necessary if they were praying that all their children would go into full-time ministry. Perhaps this would be an interesting topic for you to address sometime. I know what my response would be, but I would be interested to hear your takes as well.
And I think she's right. I said we need to revisit the issue, particularly of education of ministers, because what she says, that somebody, and I appreciate, her throwing that out there, that somebody says, well, do I need to teach my kids higher level math if I'm praying that they'll go into ministry? Well, what does that say exactly? And you get the question is basically, how are they going to use algebra if they're trying to study the Bible? Well, but I think we need to revisit that a little bit.
Yeah, there was another comment there on Facebook from Lisa, and she says, algebra is all about logic and thinking skills. Who needs them more than the servants of the living God?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, to be and I don't totally love the term minister, the way we, I guess, our connotations we put with it. But anyway, to be a minister, to be in vocational ministry, I think you ought to be as intelligent and as intellectual as you can be. Not that you need to speak over people's heads and try to sound like the know-it-all.
Right.
But it's not. You shouldn't just pigeonhole yourself to, does he know anything other than the Bible?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If you are a smart and wise man and you know other facets of education, then it doesn't come across that he's the dumb preacher. That he doesn't really know stuff, but he can preach to us. I think I agree with you. Yeah, there needs to be a way that you can speak with influence into someone's life, and depending on the setting you find yourself sometimes in ministry, you don't want to be the dumbest guy in the room. Right. That's kind of what I'm saying. Not saying that everybody has to know the same amount or you have to know about auto mechanics if you're going to be a preacher, but you ought to be a learner and a student. And
now, I like Lisa's comment there that algebra is about logic, and who needs that more than the servants of the living God. Yeah, have you taken algebra? Did you take that? Yes.
You did. I enjoy. Math was probably my favorite subject in high school.
Do you remember any particular things about algebra that you would say you use in ministry life? I'm putting you on the spot, I know, but
yeah. As far as algebraic equations, I mean, I guess that no, not that I can think of on a daily basis. I enjoy equations.
Yeah.
As I'm sitting down helping my kids with math, I was like, man, I ought to.
Yeah.
It'd be fun to just take a course again because it's so fun. But of course, obviously, you work on an annual budget, and you have to be to some degree savvy with numbers, or to say, as you're doing administrative skills, to know how to work finances, that takes some level of math, though I don't know if I'd say that's algebra. But
some of it could be, yeah. Well, I think, are you familiar with conic sections? Did you get that far in math? It's about graphing functions primarily.
Okay.
Yeah, the little graph on the grid paper.
Right.
You see the X and Y coordinates.
X-axis and the Y-axis.
X-axis, and you plot coordinates on there, and you can plot slopes on there. That, I think, is an interesting facet to preparation for not just ministry, but really any aspect of life, because you are learning to visualize something that is kind of, in a sense, abstract. How do you see numbers, right? I mean, we write them on the page, but if the number isn't a written thing on a page, what is it? It's a quantity of some kind. It's not a tangible thing, and yet this universe exists in quantities that can be measured. And graphing functions, particularly, I always enjoyed the conic sections, things like parabolas and hyperbolas and ellipses. Graphing those helps you visualize abstract things. And I think that's important to learning deep work, right? And that's important for ministry. But here's one thing that I know for sure you use in ministry that I remember learning in algebra, and that is mathematic induction.
Induction, all right.
Induction. So, for instance, if you have a sequence of numbers, right, and they all have a common difference between them, then if you can prove certain properties about the first term of that sequence, then you can induce, or by induction conclude, as generally speaking, that the same is true for all of the other terms, provided they have a common difference. So you're inducing something. And if you remember from logic class, induction is a certain way of thinking where you make an observation about something. And you can surmise, generally speaking, well, I wonder if this is true since what I saw says this. So like a good example of this is, I see, a car drive by and it has 4 wheels. By induction, I conclude that all vehicles have 4 wheels. But is that true? No, it's not.
Right.
It's an induction, which is a general proof. It's not, you're not deducing something, you're inducing it. You observe a little bit more, you realize, well, vehicles come in all types and shapes and sizes. And induction, if you think of it mathematically, we use that actually quite a lot in studying the scriptures, both induction and deduction. And we have to be careful about which one we're using. So in a sense, mathematical induction as part of algebra can teach someone proper logic. One of the best examples I saw of this one time, in fact, this is the first time I remember actually pointing out inductive reasoning in someone since being in ministry. And someone had told me once that they believed that Hebrew is the language of heaven. Right? And I don't remember what specific proofs they had for that because I don't know that there are any. Right? But it basically had to do with just the prevalence of the Hebrew language in scriptural things. Okay.
I've got a decent line of argument for that, but yeah, go ahead.
Do you? Okay. Maybe that'll be a conversation for another day. But the question is that deductive reasoning or is that inductive reasoning? And the arguments that I had presented to me, I don't, like I said, I don't remember specifically what they were, but I remember saying in the conversation that is an example of induction. That you're making a generalization. So going back to mathematical induction, can you say that Hebrew is the language of heaven? Well, I think there's a generalization. You could probably say that, right? I think that's fair.
Inductively, there would be a fair argument, you're saying.
Yeah, I think it's fair.
Yeah.
Could Hebrew be the language of heaven? Yeah, probably could be. I think there's arguments that could be made for it, but they tend to be inductive in nature, at least the conversation I was having with that person at the time. Whereas deductive would mean that there's more overt scriptural statements about something. We should make sure we're not just taking a generalization and being dogmatic about it. We have to make sure it's more than a generalization, right?
Yeah. So, and for somebody listening from the other side, we're not saying don't study scriptures. What we're saying is that don't push off all the other subjects and say, all I really need to study is the Bible. Because to me, if you, even from a different angle, if you know the Lord and you value his revelation of himself, you're going to want to develop yourself in every way that he's made you. That would be pleasing and glorifying to him. So know other things. Be able to have conversations with people about other topics in life. And of course, then you can connect them to Scripture. But anyway, interesting. I recall, it's like I had this, and I don't remember the exact conversation, but it seems like somebody in the past mentioned to me, and I don't have a historical marker for this necessarily, but a time when the preacher may have been the smartest guy in the room or the smartest guy in town. Now, maybe that's talking about, when it was out west and everybody, they're working on their cattle and just trying to build their farms and keep their families alive. And the preacher in town, he's a reader and he's a studier, so he has this opportunity to get more knowledge in ways. I don't know if that's what it's talking about or what. But anyway, I think, maybe people are seeing that shift where, people know a lot of stuff and there's information all over the place. And then there's people who know the Bible, so anyway,
yeah,
just don't, if you're going to be a preacher, just don't, study like you ought to study, and don't think that a part of education that can teach you, that can challenge you, and that can teach you things should just be dismissed so that you can just get down to one. You should narrow yourself to be a Bible student.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have? Wait. Actually, we have some more feedback. Do we want to hit that too? Man. Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Feedback on memory.
Oh wait, that one's for the after show.
Okay. Excellent.
Because if I remember right, that one we talked about in the after show.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. So I have that marked as
Okay.
after show.
I have a question that came to mind, and this had come to mind months ago, I think. But let me just back up and ask you this general question: what is a hero? How would you define a hero?
I thought this was an interesting question when I saw this on the list. Because I think that I think more so than ever in our society, the word hero is overblown.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's a lot of people being called heroes that aren't. You know, and okay, so let me back up for a second. If I were to break down the idea of a hero into maybe several component parts, I think the obvious one is that it has to be some sort of sacrifice involved.
Okay. Yeah, I asked somebody else, and they mentioned that. That was the thing that came. It was a self-sacrifice.
Yeah. Like an others over self type mentality.
Yeah.
But I don't think it necessarily has to involve the sacrifice of one's physical life.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Not all the time, though in some cases that's true. Not every heroic act puts your physical life in jeopardy.
It's not always pushing somebody off the train track.
Right. For instance, we talk about the sacrifice of, missionaries or pastors or church planters, where they essentially give up a lot of other things they could have done, right? Worldly success, to pursue the calling of God on their life. I think that is a sacrifice. In a way. Now, I realize that in a sense I'm kind of, I'm not trying to suggest I'm a hero, because there are other aspects of heroism too. That's not the only thing. But I think in addition to sacrifice, physical or otherwise, it has to be uncommon.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
If every single person in the world is involved in the same thing that people are calling heroic, then the word doesn't have any meaning anymore.
It dilutes it.
Yeah, it dilutes it. Yeah. So
you got out of bed this morning.
I think
you're a hero.
Yep, that's right. It needs to be uncommon. But as I thought about this, I thought too that the sacrifice has to be knowing sacrifice. It can't be unwitting sacrifice.
Okay.
So I'm in some scenario where, some guy is robbing a store or in the mall, right? And I'm on the second level, and I just happen to, drop my coffee over the side of the thing there, and it falls down and hits the guy in the head, and he's now unconscious. And, I saved the day from the robbery, but I have no idea what was happening.
Uh-huh.
Okay. I sacrificed my cup of coffee, but it was unwitting.
Yeah, and yet, right.
Yeah, it's hard to call something heroic when somebody did it by accident.
Okay. Yes, I understand. That's good. So you've got sacrifice.
Sacrifice
uncommon,
has to be
something uncommon.
Uncommon sacrifice has to be knowing sacrifice.
Okay.
In other words, there has to be some sort of personal resistance to that voice in my head that says, "Stop doing this. This is going to cost you."
Yes.
Right.
Right. Right.
It has to be running toward the danger rather than away from it.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Knowingly. And then the last thing I wrote down was that I think it has to be for an actually important cause.
Okay.
So, for instance, we talk about all the crazy leftist ideology in the world today, right, in America, and people making great personal sacrifices, putting themselves at risk for an agenda that is absolute garbage. Mm-hmm. Would I call that person a hero? No. I'd probably have different words for them. But hero wouldn't be one of them.
Well, and that brings up an interesting story. This is a sidetrack because I want to come back to this. And it sounds like, here you go. You're criticizing a Trump, and there's all kinds of chatter and conversation about the Trumps and about his presidency, and obviously there was a pretty solid conservative presidency, and that's great. But anyway, I just read a recent article about a Trump family member who was part of an organization, and they were, if I remember correctly, if I understood the article, they were trying to raise $500,000 to rescue 500 dogs from like China or something like that. And I'm okay, like, wait a minute, like $500,000 to rescue dogs, as if we don't, already have a bunch of dogs running around the America. I'm just like,
right.
To me, that there's a disconnect for me personally. What's so valuable about a dog over there that next time they breed, 6 more are going to be born, and you know what I mean. But I had to spend $500,000 to rescue the dogs and bring them to America, where what? Now I got to find a home for them, and people own a pet, and I just didn't connect with me. So that would be an example there of where I feel like, well, that would be some, people are really sacrificed, man. They get behind the cause and they're going to rescue these things, but it's a dog.
Right.
I mean, I understand regarding the life of your beast, but
sure,
but
yeah. Well, how about like sports heroes?
Yeah, I mean, to me it's like a misnomer. What do you mean by that? Like a sports hero? Like, what did he do? Save sports?
Well,
or
see, they
did?
sacrifice their physical bodies oftentimes, right? They put in a lot of disciplined work and effort, and they age very quickly with how hard they are on their bodies, and it's uncommon because not everybody becomes a famous sports star or whatever.
Okay,
and they are knowingly resisting that voice in their head that says, "Don't do this to your body," but at the same time, it's not an important cause,
right? And they're being like richly remunerated for it, but
yeah.
It's like, oh man, I won't eat those potato chips, but I'll go out and play a game for $25,000. Like what?
Right.
But so okay, that's a very good synopsis there of the components of heroism. And I guess I would go back to one that you said. When you said sacrifice, like a knowing sacrifice. I think we have to be careful in the spiritual realm. It's one thing for us to say, I just think the way we perceive sacrifice sometimes is we're sacrificing things that we shouldn't have or don't want. Meaning, well, I could go out and make a lot of money and be successful in the world, maybe, but God could also bring failure to my cause because I'm not following His will. And money isn't the greatest thing, and you know what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. So even somebody in ministry, it's like Jim Elliot saying, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." So if we're giving, say, well, I'm giving up, worldly pleasure and worldly, well, I shouldn't have that anyway. I mean, to some degree, that's not something that I want.
Well,
so I couldn't say necessarily that I would call even people in ministry from a certain perspective a hero. Like, God, I'm being a hero for your cause.
Yeah.
Well, you're just being an obedient servant.
Well,
you know what I mean?
I think
just doing that, which is my duty to do.
I think you're maybe splitting hairs a little bit about the financial aspect of that. Just because someone could lose it doesn't mean they would have lost it. For instance, there are people who have very high income jobs that end up in ministry, where they then struggle financially. Okay. Is that not a sacrifice?
It's a sacrifice. I don't think I'd call it heroism.
No, I wouldn't say that specifically is heroism. That's why I said there's more than that's involved.
Okay.
Sacrifice is just one thing on the list. It needs to be uncommon. It needs to be knowing. It needs to be for an actual important cause. And there's probably other things that I'm missing too. But I wouldn't dismiss that as not being a sacrifice, just because God wouldn't have given them that income.
In some ways it's a sacrifice, I guess. I just don't know that I'd go so far as to say heroism, like each person in ministry. Like, I've surrendered to ministry. I'm a hero. No, you're just obedient. You know what I mean? And I could see some people being like, oh, goodness, if you hadn't come and told us the gospel, we wouldn't have heard the gospel. You're our hero. Well, okay, but still, I wouldn't take that accolade. But to go back, what originally sort of triggered the question for me was back in the early days of COVID. It was the American truckers are heroes, and I was like, because they're keeping our country running. Now look, if you drive a truck, that's great. I respect that you drive a truck. I'm not degrading or denigrating truck drivers. I'm not. I mean, it's a viable profession. That's great that you know how to do that. I'm just saying, the fact that you keep doing your job driving a truck over the road, to me, didn't equate with being a hero.
Right.
Like, oh, we're all locked in our homes, but boy, you're getting out there in your truck on the battlefield of the germs, and you're risking your life to keep this country running. Boy, what would we do without you? I'm just kind of like, well, yeah. I mean, how many of us would have just still gone to work if we did?
Yeah.
If they'd let it?
Yeah. Well, the same was
so
said
anyway,
for,
that idea of what's a
the
hero?
same was said for healthcare workers.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know, maybe there's more of an argument for that than for truckers in that instance. If COVID was actually something that was, hugely a physical threat, which, it really wasn't.
Well, that's even that issue, right?
Yeah,
right.
Not that it wasn't a real thing, but was it a threat in maybe some sense to some people? Yes, but to say
sure.
for instance, I was able to get a free cup of coffee anytime I wanted at a local coffee shop here because they said we're going to give coffee to frontline workers, every single day. Just tell us you're a frontline worker and we'll give you a free cup of coffee. And it's like, okay, I'm not comfortable thinking of myself as a frontline worker, whatever that is, or a hero, whatever that is, but I'll take the coffee.
A frontline work, it's like you're in your fatigues and you're carrying the rifle and you're like running towards the enemy and getting shot at, and your buddies are dropping beside you. That's the concept of the frontline worker.
I suspect we might make some people angry with this conversation.
Yeah,
but,
I think we would. But and it's not to denigrate nursing and people who work in the healthcare profession, but it's just to say, I think, like you said, I think it's a little overblown. It's a little overwrought to think that, suddenly, tens of thousands of people in their normal everyday job are heroes.
Yeah.
Because there's a sickness going around. Anyway. So, thanks. That's, now, of course, I guess the big question is, what's the difference between a hero and a superhero?
Right. Wow. I have no idea where to even begin with that.
Yeah. Although, and I will mention one more news thing, as I just saw a glimpse of this. My son, he keeps up with the news, and he sends me this text, and he goes, what do you think, or something like that. And it showed, I think it was probably from the Daily Wire, that Marvel was now coming out with a homosexual superhero, and is it supposed to be Captain America? Am I understanding that right?
I read that article too, and I think I kind of skimmed it. Actually, I don't want to say I read it. I skimmed it.
Okay, maybe am I misreading?
No,
the headline?
it said something about it being Captain America, but I think it's like a different version of him, or a younger version of him, or something like that. I don't know that it's the Captain America. To me, it seems like they'd have a hard time like transforming that character midstream. Yeah, like here we've projected him to be all this, and all of a sudden, no, actually he's been in the closet all this time. I don't. Anyway, so much for normalcy in the public sector. Let me read this to you. I like the Babylon Bee on occasion. I'm not a dedicated reader to it, but occasionally I'll see a headline that interests me, and I'll click on it.
Now, for those who don't know, the Babylon Bee is a satire site who writes, and it's like from a Christian perspective, supposedly. Wouldn't you say? Is it sort of acting like it's sort of a Christian site? But they'll target things theological, political, and they'll write these kind of spoof articles that really are kind of pretty funny. Yeah,
it's they're meant to be funny, but they're certainly not true. This one caught.
But they're meant to kind of strike at a truth, right?
Yeah, I mean, and you'll see that as I read this one. The headline is, "Giant cloud of dust emerges from Vatican as Pope Francis opens his Bible."
Oh, no.
So they're taking an open shot here at Roman Catholicism, in particular the Pope. But it says here, amid the international controversy surrounding Catholic priests blessing same-sex unions, Pope Francis decided to explore the archives and consult an ancient book called the Bible to make sure he was getting it right. Phew, it's been a little while since I opened up this bad boy, he said. Let me see here. As soon as he opened up the book, a massive cloud of dust and debris catapulted off the cover, out of the window, and into the clear Vatican sky. "Mamma mia!" exclaimed several onlookers. "The Holy Father, he's reading the Bible." Again, this is probably going to make Roman Catholic people very angry, this article. But it's so true that okay,
Okay, start over.
You know what? Let me just keep reading it. It says, the dust continued to rise into the sky, obscuring the sun and causing thousands of local residents to gasp for breath. "Why didn't he warn us he was going to open the book?" people cried as they scattered in all directions, trying to avoid what was now a powerful sandstorm heading their way. The Pope read the book for a while, and after determining none of the teachings had changed since he last opened it, put it back on the shelf and announced the Catholic Church would not be changing its doctrine, at least until the Pope announces the meaning of words have changed in light of modern interpretation. "Maybe next year," said Francis. That's a zinger. That's a zinger,
Wow.
if ever there was one. But the imagery of the dust cloud just kind of, I got a kick out of it.
Yeah.
So. Oh.
And there's plenty of that, and there's some though that don't. I think there are probably a few out there that don't realize what the Babylon Bee is. So they'll come across it, or somebody will post a story on Facebook, and they'll be like, "Oh, no way," and then get kind of half irate over it and repost. "Can you believe this?" Especially if it's something that's maybe slightly more.
Well, it's funny
believable
because every time they say
dust
something
cloud.
that sets off the left in this country, the left attacks them as if, they're fake news. It's like, but of course they're fake news. They're satire.
They're a satire.
They can't take a joke because nothing's
It's hard
funny
to-
anymore because of the left. But
Yeah. All right. Well, we've got a few more minutes. What else do we want to hit here? I've got one for you. Now, see, maybe this is just going to be this whole episode is just going to be like an irritation. You're not a hero, The Pope doesn't read the Bible. Here's one more. But when thinking about Christian phraseology, and I'll give this caveat that I am an analytical person, and so words matter to me, and how things are said matter to me. And so sometimes people are probably like, okay, I get it, but that's just you're being nitpicky. But to me, it's not nitpicky, and I understand there's different kinds of people, but I think accurate expression is important.
Yeah.
And one phrase that has bothered me, and I have heard it, and I can think of somebody that I love that's used it, and so I get it. I understand I know what they mean by it in a sense, but I think we have to think through it. And that is when we're describing the crucifixion. People will say, that Jesus hung there and he was dying for our sins, and of all of our sins were put on him or whatever. And then they'll say God turned his back on his son. And they might even add, because God can't look on sin, or because God is a holy God, he turned his back on his son. Now, I just have to stop and say, number one, that's sort of, maybe that's overdoing the anthropomorphism. And what I mean by that is we give characteristics to God that reflect our understanding of humanity or anthropology, thus anthro, like a man. So we give God qualities of a man. So we say the eyes of the Lord. Well, God is a spirit, so technically he doesn't have physical eyes. Or we say, the hand of the Lord, or the arm of the Lord is outstretched. So we give him these man-like qualities. Well, in this one, he's turned his back on his son. Well, obviously, what they mean is that in some way, I don't even know if it'd be right to say, but he rejected his son. Now, Jesus did say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And I think it would be accurate to say that God in some way forsook Jesus on the cross. But to say he turned his back on him and then to try to explain it as God cannot look on sin, I just think personally isn't exactly accurate. And I'm thinking of a passage, and I should have looked it up in advance, but there's a passage in, I don't know, it's Haggai, one of the prophets, that basically, to me, is saying that God does look at sin. And what do we mean by God looks at sin?
Yeah.
Well, God knows everything. God is omniscient, so he always knows sin. There's nothing you can hide from him. So by God turned his back so that he wouldn't see the sin. What does that mean? That God, now he didn't kind of know the sin was there because he couldn't see it? Well, of course he knew the sin was there. So what does it mean he turned it? Anyway, for some reason, in my mind, I've sort of been irritated by that phrase over the years, that God turned his back on his son. No, God could be looking right at his son and saying, I condemn the sin of the world. And not, anyway.
So what do you think it means then that he forsook him?
Good, and that's getting down to what actually needs to be said.
Yeah, because the answer to that could cause potential other theological problems depending on how we answer that.
Let me go to the passage here.
Okay. Because I would hesitate to suggest that means there was disunity in the Godhead.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like the sound of that.
Yeah, well, and that's a good point. And honestly, I think humanly, for us to wrap our minds around that is probably one of the most difficult theological issues. When they say, "Well, don't you believe in one God?" Well, how can God the Son die? And we say, "Well, death is separation." Well, how can God the Son be separated? You know what I mean? Well, he died physically. Well, that was him. And back in the first century or two, you had different heresies of Christ. Well, one of those was probably I believe, arguing, well, when he reached the cross, Christ left Jesus, and Jesus was now just a man. And maybe that was partly arguing that how could God die? And so he couldn't have been God that died. He was God up to that point. You know what I mean? And so that is a
modalism.
It's a difficult thing to try to wrap our minds around. Now I'm looking for the word here. Egkatalipo. Looking at the Greek word here, to leave behind in some place. I'd have to do a word picture on it, but but at first blush, basically the idea of pushing away, of leaving. Now, obviously, they're still a part of the same Godhead, and yet Christ, with the sin of the world on him, it just presents for us something it's hard to describe. In terms of the unity of the Godhead, on which we base our very salvation. So that's a good question that you ask. How do you describe forsake? And to me, I guess you just have to go back to the word and say, here's the word used. Here's how God described it. Whether we entirely understand that, and you can only take that as far as the context of Scripture will let you take it. But maybe that doesn't sound like a straightforward answer, but that's my thought.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Part of me wants to say that in God the Father pouring out his wrath upon God the Son, that his focus, part of me wants to think that his focus would have been on punishing the sin. because obviously Jesus had no sin of his own. He bore the sins of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But in the punishing of the sins of the world, God the Father, in a sense, disregarded the safety of the Son.
Right. Yeah.
In order to punish the sins of the world.
The Son became the scapegoat, who was killed once the sins, as it were transferred to him.
Yeah. And in a sense, that in that moment of history, the Father's bigger intent, his bigger focus, if I could say that, I don't know that I can say that fully, to say that he has a bigger focus and a smaller focus, but at that point, his focus was not the safety of the person of Jesus Christ. His focus was the punishing of the sin. Disregarding, maybe, is a helpful way to think of forsaking, and I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah.
Because I can't see it as a disunity. And so
right.
turning his back on Jesus Christ sounds to me like disunity in the Godhead.
Now, let me ask you a question, because in transparency here and honesty, I don't want to be, as we read about in 1 Timothy, in the pastoral epistles, how some argue about words to the destruction of people's faith. We get into these word fights, and I'm thinking, I'm reading here 1 Timothy 1:4, and neither give heed to fables and endless genealogies which minister questions rather than godly edifying, which is in faith. And there's other verses that talk about basically getting into fights about words, which there's a passage that talks about it destroying the faith or undermining the faith of some. And so is this just one of those issues where you're like, okay, he turned his back on, big deal, now you're getting us to question the whole issue of the crucifixion and what did it actually mean? Is it helpful, or are we doing a service to at least spend a little time trying to clarify how we express what happened there to the world?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is not so much what do you think of the subject or the question, but what do you think of the questioners? Because I think some people would hear us talking about this and think, oh, they're just, dividing people and they're just trying to upend people's faith and ask dumb questions and all that. But there might be other people listening who are thinking, well, it's valuable to me too that I understand what happened there.
Yeah.
Because, I'm sitting here listening to your question. I'm going, I can't say I've ever really thought a whole lot about that. What does it mean that the Father forsook the Son? And that to me is valuable to think through that.
To me, there is some value in it, because on each theological point, to me, if you want to be able to express it in an articulate way, and I understand that unsaved people don't understand the things of the Spirit of God. So whether it's explaining it to them or explaining it to a new believer, you want to be able to explain what you actually believe and go, well, I don't really get it, but man, brother, I believe it. To me, you want to understand it. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it and you say, honestly, I think that's one of those things that it's presenting something beyond my finite mind. I want to be able to say that. I want to be able to have categorized that particular truth or that statement and say, I think that is outside the pale of my understanding. Not that it's absurd, not that it's wrong,
right,
but it is something that I can't explain to you. And so just at the outset, somebody says, man, how do you explain this? And you say, I've studied that, and I've tried to wrap my mind around it, and I just think it's one of those areas that for me, I'm going to have to say I know the Lord well enough to know that I still trust him, but I don't entirely understand what was being said there. And I think that's fair. That's okay. But instead of just coming to the topic, somebody says, oh, you're a Christian. Yeah, you're one of those people that believes God died. How can that happen? And we're standing there and go, I don't know how to explain that, at least have some answer. And if the answer is, I think it's beyond our understanding, that's fine, but I want to have an answer.
Yeah. Well, and oftentimes people asking you a question like that, thinking they're giving you a gotcha question, there isn't going to be an answer that satisfies them.
Well, and that may be true, but you might only strengthen the impression if you just hem-haw around.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
So anyway, okay. If you don't think we're entire heretics by this point, or we haven't ticked you off in an earlier part of the episode, and you're still with us, then give us your feedback at reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what you think. Send us some questions of your own. You say, man, you guys ask pathetic questions. You need better ones. Then send us something. Ask us a question worthy of asking.
Yeah, that's right. Don't just be a podcast stalker. Be a podcast engager. And,
there you go. Yes.
And that'll help us out a lot. So anyway, we do appreciate you being here. We are encouraging balance, developing perspective, and connecting faith to practice. This is Reason Together.